afternoon, everyone. This is Lynn Katz-Cherry from the Great Lakes Green Chemistry Network and Clinton Boyd from the Michigan Green Chemistry Clearinghouse. And we want to welcome you to our June webinar with Mike Belliveau from the Environmental Health Strategy Center in Maine. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Mike Belliveau, who is the President and CEO of the Environmental Health Strategy Center, and he is also the Senior Advisor to Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families, which is a collaboration of a number of groups around the country working for reform of toxic chemicals policy in the U.S. Today, Mike is going to talk about chemicals policy as a driver for green chemistry, and he's particularly well suited to do this. He is the founder and president of Environmental Health Strategy Center, which is a public health organization working for safer chemicals and sustainable economy in Maine. He serves as the senior advisor to Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families, a national coalition focused on modernizing the federal chemical management system. A social entrepreneur, Mike organized a regional trade association to promote bio-based manufacturing, the Sustainable Bioplastics Council of Maine. And maybe he'll mention it, but I think they have figured out a way to make plastics out of potatoes, which is very interesting. Mike has more than 30 years of experience in chemical hazard assessment, science policy analysis, and green chemistry solutions. He holds an environmental science degree from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and I just want to note that this is a particularly timely discussion. As many of you may know, that a bipartisan bill has been introduced into the Senate, the Chemical Safety Information Act, the first, which is a bipartisan version of an earlier bill introduced by the late Senator Lautenberg. So this is just now being taken up by Congress, and I think we're very fortunate to have Mike here today to talk to us about what's happening in the policy arena and in green chemistry. So, Mike?
Thanks a lot, Lynn. Good afternoon, everyone. As implied by the title of my talk, I am a strong believer that there is a connection between chemical regulation and progress in developing safer chemicals via green chemistry. I know I've heard contrary views to that analysis, so if there are any contrarians on the phone, I look forward to engaging you in the Q&A period. I have a little bit of a cold, so pardon my hoarseness and possible spaciness. I may stop for a sip of water here and there, but we will go right into it. And let me see. There we go. First, I think it would be worth noting with some sadness and some celebration the long life of Senator Frank Lautenberg, who passed away about a week ago. Geez, I remember flying on an airplane for the first time only as a young adult, and people were still smoking cigarettes in the back of the airplane. Of course, we were all breathing it at the time, and that was one of the many things that Frank Lautenberg stopped as a U.S. Senator. He led the effort to ban cigarette smoking airplanes, as well as undertaking many other health and safety campaigns effectively, and as you probably know, has been working for the last 8 years to fix our broken federal chemical safety system and overhaul the Toxic Substances Control Act, which we'll talk a little bit about near the end of my presentation. This photo is from the National Stroller Brigade that happened a year ago, in which the previous version of the Safe Chemicals Act was introduced with hundreds of moms who flew in from around the country and gave a real boost to the reform effort at the time that resulted in a Senate committee vote in July of last year. Again, we'll come back to that, but let's thank the Senator in memoriam and celebrate his legacy and advance his legacy, because there's obviously work to do. So first, some terminology. Maybe it's self-evident, but we're talking about changes to laws and regulations that could be good or bad, weak or strong reform that are supposed to improve management of broad classes of existing and new chemicals. Certainly single chemical regulations are part of the mix, but generally we're referring to more systematic reforms when we talk about chemical policy reform. A driver, probably also self-evident, something that moves things along, but we have to talk separately about where we're moving and how far we're going to move, because something can be a driver, but it doesn't always dictate which direction things get driven in or how far. And green chemistry, this audience I'm sure is extremely well versed in its definition and meaning, although in practice, it continues to be debated, perhaps. So I wanted to start historically. This is Nick Ashford from MIT, who has done a lot of work in this area. And way back in the early 80s, mid-80s, he investigated the progress in regulating chemicals in the previous 15 years since 1970. That was an era of very active federal legislation and regulation of chemicals in multiple venues. And his team, in Nick Ashford's analysis, documented that very stringent restrictions on chemicals have in fact spurred innovation, sometimes radical innovation for health and safety, sometimes more incremental. In other cases, such regulations have just caused existing technologies, like best available technologies, to diffuse more widely. He also documented that weak regulations can actually unnecessarily maintain health hazards. OSHA's early asbestos standard was recognized as weak and no doubt resulted in extra deaths and disabilities from asbestos beyond what was really necessary. He also has noted in his work that merely beginning to work on a chemical, scientific proceedings and conferences and listings and press coverage and other activity that focuses on a chemical can lead to innovation in anticipation well before actual regulation. And in the converse, he also documented that when regulatory uncertainty persists for an excessive period, that innovation can halter or be stifled. So I think there's ample evidence historically that we have seen advances that today we could describe as green chemistry that have been spurred by various types of chemical policies. And we'll talk about a few of those examples. Here this chart shows nearly a 90% decrease in atmospheric lead in the United States over a 30-year period, tied directly to getting lead out of most gasoline, which resulted obviously from a legislative mandate and many years of fighting. There was a brief window way back historically in 1924 when Alice Hamilton and other health and safety professionals and advocates at the time caused there to be a 6-month moratorium against introducing tetraethyl lead into gasoline. Unfortunately and tragically, that was reversed, and we were plagued with lead poisoning tied to its use in gasoline for many decades. But when we finally legislated to get the lead out, to ratchet it down and out, we saw a dramatic reduction in lead concentration in the atmosphere and exposure along highways in urban areas and so forth. So this is an example of success. A few more examples. It used to be a widespread practice to use hexavalent chromium as a corrosion inhibitor in cooling towers on not just the big mega industrial towers, but in hundreds and hundreds of small cooling towers on tops of office buildings in urban areas and so forth. This practice was stopped by regulation in California under their toxic air contaminant program in the late 80s and ended a very significant exposure to a potent human carcinogen. This was an example in which there were existing safer substitutes available that were widely adapted once the ban went into effect. So I think another success story in regulation driving greener chemistry. When we passed Prop 65 in 1986, we had hoped for and earned major leverage in actually reformulating products in industrial processes to eliminate chemicals, even though the main body of the statute that we're focused on actually only requires listing and warnings of exposure. And a number of entities have brought suit against companies that have failed to warn, thus creating leverage to get chemicals out of products as well as industrial processes. When I was at Communities for a Better Environment in California, we brought some of the first Prop 65 lawsuits against industrial air polluters and succeeded in getting them to eliminate chlorinated solvents and other contaminants as part of a negotiated settlement. And our friends at the Center for Environmental Health in Oakland have been extremely successful, and kudos to them for being vigilant in bringing Prop 65 actions. This particular example here is their litigation regarding lead in soft vinyl lunchboxes that resulted in 2 manufacturers reformulating to eliminate the lead, and eventually a settlement with 20 of them to essentially end the threat of lead from used as a stabilizer in soft vinyl products. That's just one of many examples where, again, regulation has spurred innovation and greener chemistry. CFC is another example. The solvent, CFC 113, was one of several of compounds implicated in the destruction of the ozone layer around the Earth. This photo is from a march and rally on Earth Day in 1989 in San Jose, California, outside the Almaden plant of IBM, which we documented as the largest single point source of CFC 113 emissions in the United States. In 1987, we did one of the first TRI reports as those data became available, probably the largest single source in the world at the time, 1.4 million pounds. For those of you interested, that's I think David Chatfield and Gary Cohen in the front line of the march there. And along with the Montreal Protocol that passed in 1987, the International Treaty and the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, as well as public attention like this, it drove the industry to phase out CFC 113, and IBM ended up innovating and using a high-tech version of soap and water. Common sense, and it took them 5 years to perfect the technology. So another example, positive example. Now I want to move into the phthalates. This is from an excellent report by Basket Tungkat from the Center for International and Environmental Law called Driving Innovation. Just came out recently. I recommend it to you. And he looked at, among other things, looked at the effects of primarily international regulation on phthalates. And this is a chart showing the number of patented inventions free of hazardous phthalates, either phthalate-free products or products that could be marketed without the use of phthalates. And you'll see a spike in the increase in patented inventions, starting with the earliest European Commission scientific attention and scrutiny and regulation in the late 1990s, spiking again when the REACH legislation, Europe's Comprehensive Chemical Policy, was enacted, and then perhaps spiking again when 4 phthalates were added to the candidate list as substances of very high concern. So I'll show you another example in this vein. Oops. Here is by companies, again from the CL report, showing that the 3 giants in the industry, ExxonMobil is the largest manufacturer of phthalates in the world, but these 3 chemical companies, Eastman started early in, again, number of patented inventions, aimed at phthalate-free activity after the first scientific scrutiny. But by the time REACH came into force, even ExxonMobil was investigating alternatives, and Dow Chemical stepped up its activities as well. These companies, although they're the biggest, are not alone. This chart shows that about 85 companies have patented phthalate-free related products, either chemical products or products that don't require phthalates in their use. Again, this activity was spurred by regulatory scrutiny on phthalates. I think one last chart, one last figure from this source, the CL report. Remember, when the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act passed in the U.S. Congress in 2008, as well as some of the early European scrutiny, it was primarily on children's products. And this chart shows an extremely much broader diversity of inventions that are phthalate-free, related to a broad cross-section of industrial materials and activities, where infant and children products only account for 5% of those innovations. So arguably the regulatory scrutiny on getting phthalates out of children's products has spurred a much broader progress towards eliminating phthalates. Although they're still widely used, we're beginning to see some significant entry into the market of products that don't require phthalates. That, of course, begs the question of what is entering the market, and we're all familiar to some extent or another, or concerned with regrettable substitution. And, of course, we have many examples of being dissatisfied with a chemical of concern being replaced by another. I'll show you a few of those. It gets to the challenge, which we'll come back to, of providing direction, not just drive away from hazardous chemicals, which we need more of, but direction toward safer alternatives. This definition of safer alternatives is from Maine state law and mirrors that which we see in some other statutes, but it implies a comparative hazard assessment that reduces the potential for harm. We also have in that, the second phrase in that alternative is a little bit of a qualifier or a caveat that says that a safer alternative is also something that has not been shown to pose the same or greater potential for harm to human health and the environment as the priority chemical. This is a little bit in there to help thread the needle. We have obviously a huge data gap problem with insufficient data on many chemicals, yet we have data on hazardous chemicals that we wish to move away from, and we often are not cannot readily avail ourselves of a perfect solution, but must look for incremental progress. And the green screen for safer chemicals, for example, benchmarks different levels of progress towards safer and safer chemistries. And this latter provision of the definition is a nod toward being open to incremental safer alternatives rather than as we pursue truly safe alternatives. Here's some regrettable substitutes. This one you may not have thought about or known about. It's a little historic, but methylchloroform, or TCA, trichloroethane, was widely encouraged in its usage because it was non-photochemically reactive. So the smog regulator said, perfect, use this. And the use of it actually went up significantly as California, for example, cracked down on hydrocarbons that produce, ironically, ground-level ozone, while the TCA rose to the upper atmosphere and destroyed the upper atmosphere protective ozone shield. It wasn't until the 2000s that TCA was finally phased out as a result of regulation of ozone-depleting chemicals. Another regrettable substitute, Michael Wilson at UC Berkeley did his dissertation on the problem with N-hexane used as a brake cleaner and used in a variety of other solvent purposes. causing peripheral neuropathy, long-lasting, even permanent damage to the nerves. The use of N-hexane increased as a result of regulation of chlorinated solvents, and adequate guidance was not provided as to the hazards of N-hexane, and that's still a challenge. So another regrettable substitute. A few more, and we start to get into the federal law, the Toxic Substances Control Act. 20,000 new chemicals have been introduced since the law was enacted in 1976, with only a very rushed risk screening, usually on the basis of inadequate data and inability for EPA to request data on the chemical. The new chemicals program in TOSC is often held up as the success story, but it's hardly been an overwhelming success. Here's a contemporary example. One of the replacements for the Penta BDE flame retardant that was banned in 2003, 2004 by many jurisdictions was Firemaster 550, which was a mix, and one of the constituents is a new chemical, not before in existence, 2-ethyl hexyl 2,3,4,5 tetrabromobenzoate, TBB. And even though some yellow flags, possibly red flags, were raised, EPA allowed this in the new chemicals program, which does not actually require the agency to make a safety determination. And we now are finding TBB around the world. The chemical or its degradation products are persistent, biocumulative, and toxic. Same old story, except this is a new chemical. One other regrettable substitute that people are just starting to focus on is the transition from the so-called C6 chemistry to the C8 chemistry for the perfluorinated chemicals, the PFCs. PFOA, people have probably heard of, is a notorious C8 compound used to not only to manufacture Teflon and stain-resistant, grease-resistant coatings, but also the degradation product of many of a larger family of 8-carbon perfluorinated compounds. They all degrade down into PFOA, which is extremely persistent, has a long half-life in humans, and because of tragic high-level exposure in drinking water outside of DuPont facility in West Virginia, we now have evidence of human harm, and there's many, many animal studies showing pervasive effects on health and safety. So instead, EPA, in a few-year period, when they were negotiating reductions in PFOA, allowed the new C6 chemistry onto the market in about a I think 3 or 4 or 5 year window. 150 pre-manufacturing notices were submitted to EPA to manufacture, with intent to manufacture C6-based PFCs. They all degrade into PFEXA, the 6-carbon analog to PFOA, which is also, we know, extremely persistent. It has a shorter half-life, but we don't know how short. It's probably less toxic, but we don't know how less toxic. There's just simply insufficient data. I predict that people will be seeking to ban the C6 chemistry within the decade as we gather those data. Meanwhile, we'll have a whole new family of PFCs out in the environment, so arguably regrettable substitutes. So let's shift back into existing chemicals and TSCA, the Toxic Substances Control Act. Perhaps the most fatal flaw in some respects, and certainly probably the biggest stifler to innovation in green chemistry, is the grandfathering in of existing chemicals and the very light treatment of existing chemicals under TSCA. Even though, on paper, EPA has identified a large percent of these chemicals being of potential concern, has even reviewed a few percent of them, they have taken very little action because of the severe burdens and handcuffs, effectively, that the law places on the agency. only about 200 substances subject to mandatory testing to fill health and safety gaps. You may be aware of the catch-22 in the law, in which EPA has to have data to show the potential risk of a compound before they can adopt a rule to require testing to get data on the compound. Difficult test to meet, and with very few restrictions on chemical use ever being enacted. So bad that EPA couldn't even ban asbestos after a 10-year rulemaking and series of litigation. These are photos of Joe Darabont as a young man covered in asbestos dust at a Johns Manville plant, and a few months before his death of mesothelioma in a photojournalistic, an amazing piece of work that Bill Ravanese did called The Landscape and Biography of Asbestos. Breathtaking is the name of the photojournalist production. And asbestos is still killing people daily, and it's not banned technically in the United States, nor in a number of countries around the world. In the absence of effective TSCA, states have to some extent taken up the mantle. Here we have, in the case of the PBDEs, the flame retardants, following European lead, California banned Penta and Octa in 2003. The state of Maine followed in 2004. A number of other states followed them. The chart shows a shocking increase in PBDEs over a 30-year period from 1970 to 25-year period maybe to almost 2000, while we saw declines in PCBs, success story, and DDT over the same time frame. PBDs were grandfathered in as existing chemicals. Some of their use increased as a result of replacement of uses of PCBs. Other were resulted from new uses that the chemical industry advocated for through fire safety standards. And we only found out about the PBE problem in 1998 when Swedish scientists invented an analytical method to identify unknown compounds in an environmental sample, and then said, gee, I wonder what we'd find if we looked in our archived breast milk library, in which they had frozen breast milk going back 25 years, and the green line shows what they found, and that sent shockwaves around the world. The states picked up the mantle following Europe again in banning the use of DECA, the DECA BDE, Maine and Washington in 2007, and other states followed. This also marked the birth of the green screen for safer chemicals, the 2007 report that is headlined here, showing that there were safer alternatives to the use of DECA in electronic enclosures, became the deciding, sort of the linchpin in the Maine legislature and Washington as well, deciding that yes, we could ban the use of DECA for this purpose because there was a safer alternative. In this case, though, it was one benchmark down. It was the phosphorus-based chemicals, for which there are concerns, probably growing, but at the time definitely a safer chemistry. A couple things on a few state laws. One on Maine. These were all circa 2008. Comprehensive chemical policy resulted in chemicals of concern being designated and regulated in the case of priority chemicals. Chemical use reporting was triggered for the priority chemicals, BPA and the nonylphenol ethoxylates. Among other effects, we know that Hasbro, one of the top 2 toy companies in the world, in anticipation of having to report its use of BPA in toys, surveyed their use of polycarbonate plastic, which is made from BPA, and quietly removed it from all their toys, including from the Busy Ball popper that you see indicated there, so that they did not have to report their use of BPA. Others may have done so as well. We also saw BPA phased out administratively, not by the legislature, but by the regulatory agency this year in baby food packaging. as a result of a formal alternative assessment that was required under the main law, which concluded that, in fact, there were safer alternatives to BPA baby food packaging, including other BPA-free plastic containers and various laminated pouches, and the laminated boxes as well. In Washington, the Children's Safe Product Act banned a few uses of some chemicals outright, also led to a process of designating chemicals of high concern to children, which also in this state triggers chemical use reporting that is annual and is being phased in tiers over 7 years. And as a result of 2 waves of reporting so far, more than 5,000 products have been reported as containing chemicals of high concern to children. And those data are available in a very nice searchable database on the state website in the state of Washington. Although I don't think it's been investigated, I think we can predict safely that this level of reporting and disclosure is going to incentivize considerable effort to reformulate products and to move away from chemicals of high concern, opening the door to green chemistry solutions. The California program, pending regulations, have been vigorously watched and influenced and participated in by all kinds of stakeholders, are shaping up for possible adoption, hopefully at the end of this year or near this fall. And you'll see some common features with the other state comprehensive programs, identifying a larger group of candidate chemicals based on their inherent hazardous properties. In the case of California's proposal, they will designate or name at least initially 5 priority products that contain chemicals of concern, which are candidate chemicals in those products, so product chemical combinations. And alternatives assessments or analyses will be mandated, and there's similar to the main law, actually more encompassing in its potential. The state can take a variety of risk management actions to cause the priority chemical to be replaced with a demonstrably safer alternative. So that's still a work in progress. We'll see if they get that over the finish line this year. Other states are following. There's legislation close to passage in the state of Oregon, and a number of other states have introduced similar comprehensive chemical policies. The state of Minnesota named 9 priority chemicals in a step forward a few years ago. So we're continuing to see state-level activity. And this is, I think, particularly affecting product manufacturers in thinking about their reputation and thinking about their market share, and I believe incentivizing efforts to reformulate with safer chemistries. I want to switch back a little bit to TSCR reform. This is current, and I'm trying to wrap up with this shortly. Yeah, this has actually been a campaign that's been underway in its earliest vestiges since December 2004. A bunch of us got together in the dark days immediately after the re-election of George W. Bush, and said, look, we can do TSCR reform. It's going to take 10 years. So by January 1st, 2015, and I would say we're just about right on schedule. There's been a number of bills advanced in Congress. There have been dozens of oversight hearings. There's been 1 committee vote. This is the high-level, top-line agenda of the Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families Coalition, which formed in 2009 to unify health and safety advocates and health groups and sustainable businesses and others in a united effort to reform the federal law. Action on the worst chemicals, closing the data gap, relying on the best science. Obviously, there's a lot more detail than that. Many of us, maybe everyone on this call, knows about the Chemical Safety Improvement Act that was introduced a couple weeks ago. Unexpected bipartisan development. can say more about where that came from and why, but I'll walk you through quickly some of the comparisons between existing TSCA, the new bipartisan bill in the middle, and the Safe Chemicals Act, which is the bill that we have supported because of the bipartisan, unusually broad Senate coalition behind CSIA. That's the current vehicle that is expected to move. It's not surprisingly stronger than TSCA and weaker than the Safe Chemicals Act. When I gave a grade to this upon introduction, I was giving the CSI kind of a low C, TSCA an F, strong F, and the Safe Chemicals Act a high B. You'll see that there's some action on high priority chemicals. There's some new chemical use reporting, one step down the supply chain for chemical processors. There's fewer tiers though, just a high and a low tier compared to the Safe Chemicals Act. It does, for the first time, require a determination of safety for existing chemicals in commerce, but only for high priority chemicals. The low priority just need to be deemed likely safe, and there's a concern about whether the data are adequate to make that likely safe determination to be low priority. Although the language of the standard is the same, unreasonable risk, the least burdensome or cost requirement has been taken out. It's supposed to be health-based only. This is the CSI I'm talking about. There's some consideration of vulnerable groups and aggregate exposure, but weaker than the Safe Chemicals Act. A lot of the words in the CSIA would have to be determined through rulemaking by EPA. So it says use the best science, but it doesn't say what that means, whereas the Safe Chemicals Act called for consideration of the 2008 National Academy of Sciences report, Science and Decisions, which proposed a series of specific risk assessment reforms. The new bill is lacking in a lot of deadlines. The treatment of new chemicals is actually essentially the same as in the current version of the Safe Chemicals Act, which is to require an affirmative decision for the first time on new chemicals, but not to the extreme of demonstrating safety in advance, but rather based on criteria and available data, making a determination of likely safety, which gives EPA more handles and authorities to either deny a new chemical access to the market or to allow limited access and to prioritize it for scrutiny as an existing chemical later. The new bill dropped the important action proposed on toxic hotspots of disproportional exposure, geographic-based, place-based concerns. That's a serious deficiency. The ability of the states to freely act after passage of these laws is a mixed bag on the negative side primarily, although the new bill does say that states are always free to require chemical use reporting and alternatives assessment and to list priority chemicals. It proposes to preempt new state requirements merely upon listing and scheduling of priority bills, and the concern is that those priority lists could be stacked up and then sit there with no action. The assessment of alternatives is tortured and twisted in the CSIA. It actually puts a burden similar to existing TSCA on EPA. If they want to ban or phase out a use of chemical, EPA has to demonstrate that the alternatives are safer, whereas the Safe Chemicals Act said that industry could get out of a restriction on a chemical if they could demonstrate that there was not a feasible alternative, safer alternative available. No green chemistry funding or programs. So a much weaker bill. Just for information, just a couple more slides, but for those explicit green chemistry policies that are not in this new bill, Here's what was on the table previously, a whole section on safer alternatives, green chemistry engineering, a nod toward expedited review of new chemicals and formal recognition program, but also funding and academic research centers for green chemistry and workforce training and education. And then in the previous Congress, the Waxman-Rush bill also had a decent alternative assessment process defined, and all these are missing from the new bipartisan bill. The Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families Coalition issued a statement yesterday commending the bipartisan effort, not opposing the bill, but not supporting the bill, saying that it needs to be strengthened, that improvements could be made within the proposed framework to deal with the weaknesses in these broad categories that I mentioned. And that's the aim, is to move toward TSCA reform and correct the deficiencies that are on the table. And there is a credible path to accomplish that, although not easy, because nothing is ever easy, especially in Congress. Someday TSCA will be reformed. The state role needs to continue. The states have a strong say in regulating consumer products sold in their state, and would like to see more expanded action for prioritizing data collection and alternative assessment. Actual restrictions on chemical use at the state level are very politically difficult to achieve, even without preemption. That ultimately is the final recourse. But as we've seen, the simply focusing and acting and collecting information on chemicals of high concern can and has incentivized green chemistry. So to wrap up, I do see strict regulation of chemicals as a strong driver historically and presently. If Congress fails to reform TSCA once again, that continued uncertainty will stifle innovation. I think some reform is better than no reform. Obviously, the weaker the reform, the weaker the response, particularly to the extent that we don't crack down on the existing largely petrochemicals that have been grandfathered in and need to be eased out of the marketplace. In addition to the driver, though, we need firmer direction and market demand for safer alternatives and definition of safer alternatives so that we can wrestle with and avoid regrettable substitutes. So that's how to get a hold of me. I welcome communications, and I look forward to some Q&A in the minutes we have remaining. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mike. That was really interesting and very helpful, I think, in comparing the different legislation and also demonstrating how a lot of the previous regulation has really stimulated innovation. We have a couple of minutes left for questions. I don't see any questions here, but you still have a few minutes if you want to throw one in there. In the meantime, I will ask Mike what you see as the immediate future for this bill. I mean, what do you foresee will be are the odds of getting these changes in and of moving forward with TSCA reform?
Sure. Well, for better or worse, this particular bill, the Chemical Safety Improvement Act, has a significant chance of being sent to the President's desk and being signed into law in the current Congress. That's because of the unusually broad left, right, center coalition of sponsors that are on the current bill. That's notwithstanding any of the many weaknesses that the bill has. And the reason, although it was unexpected, the reason it broke that way is that Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families and our allies were unsuccessful in getting Republican co-sponsor for the Safe Chemicals Act because of a really aggressive push by the chemical industry, whose power is concentrated in Washington, D.C., to deny a Republican co-sponsor, even though we had several lined up at different times. We responded in kind, and we knew that Senator Vitter from Louisiana was working to introduce a chemical industry bill and we effectively denied a Democratic co-sponsor to that bill. And so the unexpected break in the logjam, the pressure that was breaking up, was Senator Vitter approaching Senator Lautenberg saying, if you work from my frame, I will make changes that you want. And that's the deal that they struck, not us, and that was the Chemical Safety Improvement Act that was introduced a couple weeks ago. So, you know, the prospects for passage of that bill are high. However, due to the sort of unusual dynamic of the United States Senate, in which you need 60 votes to pass a bill, and in which the deals are basically struck in advance rather than at the end of the process, we have a situation where the deal has been struck, but there's changes that both sides and other stakeholders want and need, if only to simply clarify ambiguities and correct unintended consequences. So the language of the bill will change, and I think you know, a lot will depend on you know, senators, Democratic senators stepping up to pick up the torch left by Senator Lautenberg. So that could be Senator Gillibrand from New York, or Senator Udall, or another. And also a lot will depend on the chairman, Senator Boxer of the Environment and Public Works Committee, who definitely wants to see changes to this bill. But I think it is possible that the strengthening improvements that I described only sketchily could actually get made in committee, and the bill is marked up later this year. I think there's a credible pathway towards achieving it. It's also possible the whole thing could collapse and will be without TSCA reform for another Congress, with the Republican House likely to stay in Republican hands for several more Congresses. This may be the best opportunity, you know, in a while to ratchet down and modernize TSCA to a degree, however compromised.
I have a couple more questions I'd like to sort of squeeze in here before we end. One question is if you could explain briefly what aggregate exposure is.
Yeah, good question. Aggregate exposure is a very important concept. It means that when you take a look at a chemical, you should consider all sources of exposure to that chemical. So, and this is not often how it's been done historically, and certainly not how the industry has wanted it to be done. So, for example, if you were looking at a, I don't know what, say, chlorinated solvent in degreasing, you would have to consider all the other uses of that chlorinated solvent and consider in aggregate what the hazards and risks are of that chemical. And obviously the more uses of a chemical you consider, the more likely it is you'll conclude that some, if not many of those uses, or all of them, need to go away. So it also reflects in part real-world conditions. A step up beyond aggregate exposure is cumulative exposure, and that's more controversial, and the science is a little bit less developed, but in many cases you consider, we are able to consider multiple exposures to different chemicals and make reasonable decisions, for example, about the phthalates as a whole family of chemicals that should be treated the same rather than individually. A step even further in cumulative exposure that's referred to in the Science and Decisions report is the necessity to consider the unique susceptibility of subpopulations, psychosocial risk factors, poverty, violence, poor nutrition, inadequate access to health care. These are cumulative risks that interact with chemical exposure to compromised health. That's very challenging, but that's the direction we need to point to them.
I have 3 more questions. I'm just going to whip them off really quick.
Yeah, I'll be sure.
Some brief answers here. In your opinion, is this TSCA improvement worth the drawbacks?
If we can strengthen it, yes, all things considered. I mean, the bill as proposed is stronger than TSCA. It's unnecessarily weak, even beyond what the industry needs. So it should be strengthened. If it's strengthened, we will support it and seek to pass it.
How will
Unfortunately, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just trying to squeeze in a few more questions before we end.
Please.
Didn't mean to cut you off. How will the CSIA state preemption affect Maine state reform efforts?
Well, as proposed, this preemption is not, the preemption provision not very good, and that's something that needs to be changed. It will, as drafted, it would allow Maine or another state to continue to prioritize chemicals, to continue to require chemical use reporting in products, to continue to require product manufacturers to assess safer alternatives to the use of those chemicals. So all that could continue even as this bill has been proposed. What it would preempt is existing restrictions on chemicals would be preempted once a substance is goes through a completed safety determination by U.S. EPA, and then it would also, after enactment, if this bill became law, new restrictions on chemicals would be prohibited at the state level if EPA had listed a chemical as a low priority or scheduled a high priority chemical for safety determination. There's a danger there in bogging down to a point where states are preempted and EPA is not taking any action. So those need to be significantly tightened, and there's a lot of activity underway by the states and advocates to rebalance that provision.
I'm going to try to sneak in one last question before we end. Any opportunity to include nanomaterials assessments, including biotech? REACH and REACH-K have included submitting physiochemical information, for example.
Yeah, I believe nanomaterials are already considered a chemical substance under the Toxic Substances Control Act, which, as we know, doesn't really work. Under the Safe Chemicals Act, the unique properties and attributes of nanomaterials were called out for consideration and data gathering. I'll have to look at this new CSIA. I suspect that it's silent or vague because a lot of the language is more general. So nanomaterials, though, are in the mix under Toxic Substances Control Act, existing or reformed. That's not to say the regulation is adequate. So let's do some work to focus on that and figure that out. I'm not sure of the other part of the question. I don't think TSCA really reaches synthetic biology, if that was the question. If it's a bio-based chemical, certainly that's a TSCA chemical that has to go through the system. So the existing law or reformed TSCA would consider a bio-based chemical new or existing no differently than a petrochemical-based chemical.
Great. I'm sorry to cut you off, but we're a little bit after 3 o'clock, and I wish we had more time because obviously there's a lot of interest in this topic. Thank you so much, Mike, for your presentation today. I want to remind people that you will be able to access the recording of this webinar at the websites that you see on your screen right now. And also we have posted the webinars from this previous webinars that you can also access if you missed one or you want to listen again. We encourage you to go to the websites and do that. So once again, remember to register again for the July 24th webinar with Bridget Luther, and I hope I'll see some of you next week at the Green Chemistry and Engineering Conference. And with that, we'll thank you again and say goodbye.
Bye.